reactionary solution that I've seen is like maybe put people that commit crimes in jail. It's just, I don't know. It's
Sounds very unprogressive of you.
Exactly, like, so you don't need to wonder. They're already coming up with their kooky, reactionary, over the top ideas. The proletariat.
I hate to see it.
Yeah.
Goddamn
Normal
criminals
making decisions. That's unacceptable.
Requesting we put criminals in jail. Like,
what's next?
Oh, jail sounds an awful lot like an institution to me.
All right. On that note, we're getting started here. So today we're going to be tackling the issue of homelessness. So I think depending on where you live, if you're in some of the major Canadian and American centers, and sometimes like even some of the smaller ones, you probably have noticed an uptick in homelessness and like homeless encampments and stuff like that, and probably seen it on the news. So we want to take a look at this and see what might, like what's actually going on. Is it really getting worse? What are the causes? What are the solutions? And basically, what does it mean for, regular folk who, just deal with it day in, day out, or sometimes don't. So, Hubbards, do you want to kind of kick us off with just a overview and some maybe terms and definitions?
I guess. I think setting the stage for what we're actually talking about is we do need to go through definitions, because homelessness is like, it's a very like broad category, and lots of people fall into it, when I think what we're talking about and what we want to talk about is like a much more limited case of what is called chronic homelessness. So
I've got some numbers on that just to give a sense of how small of a subset that actually is in the homeless population. Because in Canada, there's roughly 235,000 homeless as of 2016. Huge number, 235,000. Like, that is a big headline grabber. And then you say chronic homelessness, which is what we'll be talking mostly about. That is 4,000 to 8,000. So not even 10,000 in all of Canada. And then episodic homelessness, which means people that are homeless on multiple episodes of their life, in and out of homes, but not on the streets living for years at a time. That's 6,000 to 20,000. And then you have transitionally homeless, which are people that are just homeless for a very short period of time in between homes. And that is 176,000 to 188,000. Or in other words, the chronically homeless, and even if you include the episodic homeless, there are 10 to 20 times more transitionally homeless, which are people that will just temporarily be homeless for a short period of time, and will often take full advantage of shelters, in the sense that they'll go to a homeless shelter because they don't have a home. They'll be provided for, and they'll find a home, get back on their feet, back into the swing of things. So we're focusing on a small subset, and a lot of times that subset is what most people think of, and yet the numbers that are bandied about are actually this whole group that's considered homeless, that really skews a lot of the discussions, especially that the activists like to focus on.
Yeah, I think those numbers are like a good illustration, because, and I mean, anyone with some degree of estimation would realize like over 200,000 homeless people in Canada is not realistic, in terms of like, if you were using the term chronically homeless, like you just don't see those numbers around. That would be insane.
The whole city.
Yeah, like that'd be
two.
That'd be just insanity. So again, like I think anyone who's lived in a major city, yeah, it's very easy to pick out what a chronically homeless person looks like. Or even like, I guess you could roll some of the episodically homeless people that are going to be in those situations as well. And those numbers make much more sense, like 10 to 30,000 people at any given time, right, in the country.
I do want to interject one thing. Like, you'll see in some data for Canada, at least, like 450 to 900,000, they call it hidden homelessness. So that's like another category where it's basically, you're transitioning from, it kind of falls into that one that Price was talking about, that 170 to 180,000 transitionally homeless, but some estimates range that all the way up to nearly 1 million, which again, but they include people who are like,
Also,
they're moving from one house to another, like they just got to stay out of friends or something. So I think they would even capture in that data students coming home from school, and then they have to go get another apartment and stuff like that, like, because I've seen these headlines of like 900,000 hidden homeless in Canada, and that is a pretty misleading fact, because
so the big difference between transitionally homeless and hidden homeless, that means hidden homeless are so much more numerous, is basically, as far as I understand it, the transitionally homeless genuinely end up out there on the streets with no one to turn to except a homeless shelter. Like, they are well served by the homeless shelters, from what I can tell, because they're usually in a position to use them. Whereas the hidden homeless are hidden because they aren't in a homeless shelter or in any of the homeless aid categories, so they don't get picked up on a traditional survey. They are, by definition, staying with friends, relatives, or others when they're homeless.
So I, at multiple points in my life, probably would have fallen into this. I would say most students in general at some point would fall into this. So just wanted to...
Couch surfing is often what people call it, to be polite.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not like... I just want to clarify that, people will point this out saying, well, what about these hidden homeless? Well, it is not actually representative of what's going on, in terms of, like, these are not going to be people who wind up on the streets. Like, maybe a very tiny chunk of them wind up through random happenstance or something unfortunate, but the vast majority of those, like, I would say probably 99%, maybe 99.9, are not, like, they're not at risk of falling.
Well, I think like it's, people move up and down the categories, right?
Yeah,
to a degree, right? Like a chronically homeless person starts off probably as a hidden homeless, right? And then goes to what someone would be a transitionally homeless person who's actually using the shelter. Then they would be considered an episodic homeless, and eventually they just get, in such a bad situation that they're, meet the definition of chronically homeless, right? So there's a lot of like movement between categories.
Yes.
But I think that it's the snapshot picture for the numbers that is important, where you're looking at, like, at any given time, how many people fall into these different categories. And again, I think the common sense kind of picture of what a homeless person is, like, the hidden homeless would not register on any reasonable person's definition of a true homeless person. If you have a friend that's willing to let you stay in their house, I mean, yeah, you don't have your own house, but you're not homeless. Like, that's just I don't know, it's almost like a pointless category in terms of what actually is meant by homeless.
Yeah, and I just wanted to point that out because attention-grabbing headline saying, like, look at nearly 1 million Canadians are, at risk because they're hidden homeless, and it's pretty much the huge majority of those people are not going to wind up in any sort of chronic situation.
Yeah, so I don't know what other kind of definitions or fine tuning we want to do there. Like we were saying, we're going to focus on the chronic homeless population, essentially. I guess, and again, many of these terms and categories or whatever, there's not like good definitions out there, or even good studies or information. So for a lot of this, you just kind of have to use your, like, common sense, reasonable, like, what is meant by chronic homeless. Like, yeah, it's exactly what you think of in your mind when you think homeless. So do we want to go on to kind of like a chronology of the homeless situation or population in kind of, I guess it's mostly North America that we looked at, but
yeah, I think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, so I think the like when talking about, like, the chronic homeless population, in present day, it's like made up of generally the two things you're gonna like automatically associate with it is mental illness and substance abuse. And these two kind of factors are more, like it's someone with like very deep problems most of the time, right? Like that's why they end up there.
And one of the big intuitions I believe that most people have about the chronically homeless that's fairly accurate is there's going to be a high correlation between mental illness and substance abuse because people are attempting to self-medicate this mental illness.
I think it's intertwined, and it goes the other way too, right? Like you can make your mental problems worse by taking substances. Your attempts to self-medicate can backfire and then just spiral you down the deeper and deeper.
Mm-hmm. I think lots of times you'll yo-yo because of the withdrawal and then getting the hit and then the withdrawal. Like there's a reason they don't prescribe a lot of these drugs to treat those illnesses. Like alcohol being the perfect example, most people are used to. You get some antidepressant effect that keeps it addictive for people with depression, but actually drinking the alcohol is depressive in the moment you're drinking it. It's not a good solution to depression by any means.
Yeah, I don't think there's been too many psychiatrists saying, "Oh, you just need a fifth of a fifth every day, and you'll be right as rain." So, with that in mind, I think going back in time, like in history, these people would have been like, a certain subset of like mentally ill and deeply dysfunctional people have always existed. It's never not been the case, right? Like that just is what it is in terms of. There's a probability that you have some combination of environment and genetic predisposition where you're just not very functional and have serious mental issues that prevent you from, doing what everyone else does to get by. Before these people would have been essentially kind of left to die or maltreated by their families or whatever.
Locked up in barns, locked up in basements. Euthanized. That was not uncommon.
Yeah, like they would have just been essentially neglected to the point of death prior to, say, the 20th century. And then in the 19th and 20th century, they started actually, the Western world started developing hospitals and psychiatric care and, police forces and all this stuff. And these people started getting collected into basically mental institutions and hospitals for many decades. And then in, say, the 1950s, the post World War II, a lot of like reports on the conditions of the institutions that were taking care of these people, mental hospitals and stuff, came out, and obviously they were pretty terrible. They weren't well funded. A lot of them had tried, pretty barbaric treatment protocols and experimentation, et cetera, and so basically progressive politics made a push to shut down these institutions, and there was basically laws in the U.S. in particular that made it impossible to involuntarily commit people anymore. So they just laws and rulings by the court made it so that the bar for involuntarily committing someone to an institution was so high that it just wasn't practically possible anymore in a lot of cases. And they also just started shutting down and defunding a lot of these institutions. And I guess the hope was that there would be like kind of more integrative community care where rather than, these people getting treatment in some sort of horrible institution, the mental hospital with shock therapy or whatever that was done, that they would, go into these community, be integrated into the community, cared for outpatient care, and they'd get, support within the community and they could stay integrated in the community. And that just didn't really pan out, I guess. It never... Yeah.
It became really difficult to get public approval for halfway houses to be involved in communities, like where, these people would be integrated into your community, because shockingly, most people figured, well, that's a great idea, but not in my backyard.
Yeah, your home
Yeah,
value is not going to be particularly great if you have the halfway house, sitting beside it.
yeah, and I think another part of it too that is just like a lot of these people aren't going to do well in when the care starts to become voluntary, right? Like if you have schizophrenia or some other very serious mental health problem, the likelihood that you're going to be able to voluntarily and consistently, get yourself to the community care center on a regular basis, get your meds, take your meds, unsupervised or with limited supervision in the community, in a community integrated model. I don't think it played out very well, right? Like there was going from an institution where it's closed walls and 24/7 supervision to community care. There's just like a huge drop off in structure, right? So
And one of the
I think
the basic characteristics of a lot of severe mental illness is that the person doesn't think they're mentally ill and therefore do not require such, monitoring or like treatment, right? Like that's a pretty common thing with such like pretty substantial mental illness. So you're just going to have a lot of people even think that like, oh, okay, I'm out. I'm good to go then. Like there's nothing wrong here. And so it like even like they just don't even think that they need to be treated, right?
yeah, and I think there was a psychiatrist who coined a phrase that kind of sums up the transition in that time period. Daryl Treffert, and he penned a letter to the editor, and he titled it "Dying with Their Rights On." And basically the summation of the letter was that they had switched. There had been like a culture shift in terms of treating these people, these dysfunctional people with serious mental problems, with frank paternalism to frank abandonment. That was his phrase, and he didn't. He obviously saw neither as desirable. He wanted a more middle ground where you were able to involuntarily commit someone into a mental hospital before their problems got so bad that they were basically a goner. And that like he was overseeing a psychiatric hospital at that time, and he had seen like multiple cases of people that he knew were circling the drain and were going to die, and yet they couldn't do anything because of the changes in the law and the court rulings that were made that set the bar extremely high in terms of involuntary commitment. And yeah, so he wanted to start a conversation essentially about a more balanced bar that would allow people to retain their rights, their freedom rights to a degree, but also giving back some of the tools to healthcare professionals to intervene when it was clear that it was going to lead to bodily harm for themselves or others around them.
And to give a bit more defense of the institutionalization that existed and why people would try to defend it, because I think now we generally stick with the idea that led a lot of people to push for deinstitutionalization, that there was a lot of abuse and there was bad treatment and people weren't getting much better, and it just wasn't good for the patients, which was often the case and was a good reason to push for deinstitutionalization. But in the case of the psychiatrists and psychologists that saw good results out of institutions, often those institutions would basically be a 24/7 monitoring for people with mental illnesses, and they would try to get them medication to bring them back to a better baseline. And then they would do 3 square meals a day. They'd do 12 hours of manual labor a day, which like that is hard work, but hard work is actually demonstrated to be quite good for helping you get out of the mental illness rut. And they would achieve success in a very humane fashion compared to what the bad institutions that use less humane methods would fail to achieve success with those less humane methods. Like there were institutions that weren't, there's a whole spectrum of institutions that had different ways of dealing with mental health.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like it wasn't just all bad. There was definitely good institutions doing good work, but I think it was like a bit of a reactionary push because of like the what's the word? Sensationalization of like the extreme abuses and horrible conditions of some of the worst ones, right? Like that was like just perfect fodder.
The abuses that can happen when someone has complete control over your life as given by the courts. Like that's, you can understand where the pushback against it came from, but it's not that it was always bad.
Yeah, it's like prison, right? Like there's plenty of very bad stories about various prisons because once you give someone a high degree of control over someone else, there's going to be abuses no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that kind of brings us into kind of more modern era where the problems have seemingly been getting worse since like the 70s or 80s, more or less. With ebbs and flows to a degree. Like I think there was a particularly bad period of time in the 80s in the US. But the trend has been towards a higher homeless population, chronically homeless. And
did you find good information on chronically homeless during the Great Recession period? Because there was an incredible amount of overall homelessness, but I believe most of that was transitional because of the foreclosures.
It seemed to like the only place that I found like data on was Vancouver. That was the only one I looked at, and it did seem to spike a bit post 2008. Like it was a kind of a noticeable uptick, but that's just for one city, right? So I don't know if that's.
It was like the U.S. population of all types of homeless was 1.6 million during 2008, and it's down to recently being around 550,000. And that the American stats that I saw didn't break it down to within categories, so I couldn't see how many of those were chronically homeless, whether that percentage stayed the same or not.
Yeah, I didn't see any of that information. But of chronically homeless, like say in Vancouver, like I said, there was a bit of a spike up post 2008. And it's been kind of trending up for the last, say, 2 decades, more or less, in Vancouver. And I think it's similar in other Canadian cities, but I didn't look at category specific.
Fairly similar to the West Coast of America, probably.
Yeah, and then I think the impetus for why we did pick this topic for the podcast is, fast forward to modern day, there's been like multiple cities where the homeless problem has gotten just undeniably like damaging for the city and just like in your face in terms of like encampments and harassment and crime and all the sorts of associated problems.
Needles, stuff like that. Yeah, where it's just gotten to the point where certain areas are just complete no-go zones for your regular citizen, and they're not small areas either. It's not like one little block is pretty rough. They spill out into pretty large areas that have just become economic and cultural dead zones.
Yeah, and I think like in the last few years with COVID, I think it's gotten like the COVID pandemic. There was an increase, and things have been pretty bad in some of these cities. And the argument, I guess, is what to do about it. Again, like similar to the 1970s or 60s with the deinstitutionalization, you have like a progressive movement that has one version of how to solve this worsening problem, and then you have other ideas about how to solve it. And that's kind of where we are now, with the problem getting worse and different ideas on how to fix it.
For instance, Vancouver's response to a 400-person tent city was to get rid of the tent city with police action, and then to defer all the questions about where those people are going, given by reporters, to BC Housing, which then has no idea how they're going to deal with these people, but they've got to get them a house. Although, an interesting thing is that apparently they brought online 1,000 units of housing last year. So if you have 400 people, if you could do 1,000 units of housing, like maybe they will manage to find homes for all these people. But that is a lot of people. Like 400 people to just basically get up and tell them they can't be there and go talk to those guys about trying to get a house because you're not allowed to be in a tent anymore.
400 people who are likely mentally ill and drug addicted. The majority, if not almost all of them, right? So, like one of the things that should be pointed out with the chronic homeless, when I was doing my research, like when we were kind of defining terms, we were saying that, you have the chronic homeless and transitional. When people talk about like, the causes of homelessness, when you really get down to the brass tacks of chronic homeless, almost all of them have some form of severe mental illness and drug addiction. It's like I saw quite a bit of research from my research from the certain segments of the population who are trying to help out with homelessness kind of deny that. But when you talk to those on the ground, it's virtually all of them when they're in the chronic state. So it's going to be an unbelievable mess for the BC Housing and Vancouver, because you have 400 additional people that you got to try to figure out where they're going to go, and you're going to have to deal with like the social implications and dynamics that come with dealing with somebody who's severely unwell.
Well, I think often the big problem here is that they, even with a housing first initiative, it's like you get housing and then they expect that house alone to then lead the person to some sort of epiphany that they need to seek help for their mental illness and addiction. And well, if that's not the case, then the person's going to eventually end up homeless again, because they still have the addiction and they still have the mental health problems.
Well, I think that's a good starting point on like explaining like the progressive approach, which I guess you could say has already made the argument from a lot of people is that the progressive approach is one of the reasons things are getting worse. But essentially, like the new progressive approach to the homeless problem is like you already mentioned, Price already mentioned, housing first. So that's like you offer no strings attached housing, because clearly homelessness, to solve it, you just give them a home. Boom, bang, bong.
Yeah, and to like further flesh out housing first, when Hubbard says like no strings attached, that's exactly what the housing first initiative people say. They say you will provide full housing for each individual, and it's rights based. Therefore, it's permanent housing. So we're talking not a shelter. It is in a full apartment. You're given the key. It's yours, and it's permanent. And there are no compliance. So there are no sorts of requirements that you are sober or you are undertaking and sticking to a sobriety plan or a treatment plan for mental illness. It's completely, it is basically, here's an apartment in downtown Vancouver. It's yours permanently for an ongoing basis. And the basic idea, from what I can tell from reading, I'm on their website right now, like one of the big ones in Canada, and they pretty much say like this will be like the main thing that fixes housing, for homelessness. Like if you just give them the house, that's the first thing, and it is a precondition for recovery. That there is no way anybody will ever recover from anything unless they have this house permanently on an ongoing basis with no strings attached. So, when it sounds like a little bit extreme, it kind of is.
Yeah, so I think that's like one part of it. The second part is essentially like, how do you provision services? And the progressive like response is you bring in as much services, so like social workers, food, addiction counseling, like all these things that you'd talk about as like helping this population, right? You just make as much of it as you can available in the areas where the people, the homeless are. So you just bring in all these services. If they are congregating in this downtown area, bring all these services in and you offer to them. And the big emphasis, again, much like the deinstitutionalization, is an emphasis on freedom, their freedom. So you can't push these people into any of these treatment programs or to use any of these services. You have to wait until they're ready, and they have to voluntarily decide to use them. And you just keep adding to the amount of resources and amount of services until there's enough that presumably everyone that wants to takes it, and eventually all of them will voluntarily take it at some point. And that's combined with, like, in order to make that happen, that's combined with very, very lax law enforcement. So a lot of the time, in a lot of the most progressive cities like Seattle or San Francisco, and or even Vancouver has done some of this, they stop enforcing criminal code, essentially, and they will not arrest for drug possession. They will not arrest for petty theft. They will not arrest for shoplifting and even minor assaults or scuffles. All these sorts of like smaller misdemeanor offenses. I guess that's what it's called in the U.S., misdemeanor. They'll just stop enforcing those altogether. And then in terms of when they actually do arrest people and bring them through the legal system, they'll give them very lenient sentences. So sometimes they'll be back out in the street within days or weeks because they'll get...
Is it same day?
They'll get time served or very tiny sentence or some sort of probation measure that's never enforced. All sorts of these like very inconsequential enforcement actions. And obviously when that starts to happen, the other thing that follows is, like, a lot of the time the police just stop doing anything because what's the point? There's a lot of laws that they can't enforce, and even the ones that they do technically still enforce, it doesn't matter because the judges are just going to release the person, like same day or within a few days or weeks. So then the cops will just stop making arrests because what's the point? You're just going to book them and have to either release them or they're going to get a slap on the wrist anyway. And I think, like, to put some numbers on this, in Seattle, there was one guy collected data on the top 100 offender list in Seattle, and 100% of the top 100 offenders in Seattle were homeless. 100% of them showed signs of substance abuse, and about half had been assessed by the courts to have a serious mental illness. The average number of criminal offenses was 36, and so that was like lifetime total of these offenders. But in the previous year, they had averaged 7 jail bookings in the previous year. So they'd been to prison or jail 7 times in the previous year, which is insane that someone that's committing offenses at that level is still on the streets. So, and just like another point about like how that like translates into police behavior and enforcement that way. There was a Seattle business, a shopping place that had 599 cases of shoplifting in 1 year, and of those cases, 8 ended up being prosecuted. So you look at the crime statistics that are reported just don't translate to what's actually happening on the ground, because those 600 shoplifting cases are not going to make it into the crime statistics. And the reason that the 8 of the 600 were prosecuted, most of them were only prosecuted because the shoplifter assaulted someone along the way. So it had to escalate for it to even get prosecuted. Like it just starts to get pretty crazy. You guys have anything to add there?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, like, imagine being a regular person living in an area or owning a business in that area, and how unbelievably depressed and just demoralized you must be, like, witnessing this and knowing that the cops can't do anything. It's the same couple of guys showing up, robbing your store, assaulting people. I watched a video, an interview with it's a coffee shop actually in Vancouver, and they have a problem. It's the 4 same kind of homeless individuals who camp out on the front of the store. They've assaulted staff. They've assaulted the owner. They have they leave dirty needles all over the place. They have defecated all over the area. And this area, like, I know this area, it's nice. Like, it's actually kind of a nice area. And the owner is pretty much making a plea to the news, because he will call the cops, and the cops say, well, is somebody being currently assaulted? And he says, well, no, not at the moment. The person's gone. But he's threatened to come back the next day. And the cop says, well, nothing we can do. It's kind of out of our hands. You need to call the city. And then, of course, he calls the city, and the city says, oh, have you tried calling the cops? So it's just, it seems like the police in this area within Vancouver, they just can't enforce things properly. And then the city also doesn't want to deal with it, probably because, due to the progressive leanings, that, it's just small, can't really interfere with them. And so this guy and his business are pretty much screwed. And so he, he's in a lot of trouble. And I actually know somebody personally who had one of their businesses completely destroyed by homeless encampments right outside. They would camp up on the street, and people stopped coming. It was a restaurant, pretty nice one, pretty successful. So, started like a bit of a chain within the city, and it killed one of the outlets. And because Vancouver wouldn't enforce the no camping ban, the cops couldn't do anything, and these people would camp out, sometimes yell at customers and be rowdy, and just cause general problems. And the business eventually folded because just nobody would come anymore. And I remember talking to him, and he was just absolutely devastated, because same thing. It's like nobody within the city, gives a damn, and they don't want to deal with it. And the cops feel like their hands are tied. So, just looking at this from the perspective of the people who have to live and deal with this every day, like, it would just be absolutely maddening and infuriating, and just so demoralizing. I would never, ever in my own life want to have to deal with that every day. So,
well, and yeah, going back to Seattle, like, there was a judge who handed out a harsh sentence to one of these repeat offenders, and the backlash was to his harsh sentence was so bad that basically all the what would you call it, public defenders who defend these people started submitting basically like I don't know what the exact legal term is, but it's some sort of form you can submit to say that the judge should recuse themselves due to bias, and it's automatically granted if the defender's lawyer submits it. So he just like wouldn't see any more cases, and he just eventually retired because he wasn't getting any cases, and he was being railed against by all these lawyers. So it's even in the justice system, it's gotten to the point where a judge can't even hand down a sentence to put someone in jail for a crime without backlash. And so I think the going to like wrapping up that like the model, like one of the addicts that was interviewed for the Seattle documentary I saw, they said that it's essentially an attitude of support them and love them, but to death. So, just like provide all these services, try to like get as many support services in around them as you can. But her take on it was that that's definitely not the right answer. So I don't know. Do we want to go to like the other side of it, the other possible solution?
Yeah, I think I'm good to move over, unless.
Yeah, might as well.
Yeah, so I can kind of kick this one off. So there has been some pretty good work done in Europe. They had some severe problems in the early 2000s with homelessness. And they decided to take what is actually would be considered in many circles as a pretty progressive tact, but in some would not be considered progressive in, I guess, North American standards. And so I think just sticking with the Netherlands, they basically had a policy of not allowing, when we have like what people think of like the homeless encampments and whatnot, the Dutch viewed those, and I think correctly, as open air drug scenes. They did not call them homeless encampments because they realized like that's not what's going on. These are not, a group of people who are suffering from, they lost their job and now they're just tenting out until they find another one. These were basically gatherings of people who were just sitting around doing drugs, panhandling to get more money for drugs, and had mental illnesses on top of that. And so they decided to build a large strategic approach. And the basic two pillars were, it was client-centered, so meaning that every person who was homeless, like a chronic homeless person, was going to have like their own program that centered around them. And it was also going to be like kind of centrally administered. So it wasn't going to be like, a collection of a whole bunch of different services. Just to kind of put this in perspective, Canada has 170,000 different services for like homelessness, and that like those come from all over the different governments levels and nonprofits and churches and all of that. And basically what the Dutch did, it was like, no, we're centralizing this, and then we're going to make sure that like, at every level, these like the different like departments can like seamlessly integrate so that we can track people and make sure that they're on track basically. And their strategic plan, they started this in about 2006, I believe, somewhere around there, and they had about 10,000 persons that they were like considered to be pretty like in that very chronic drug addiction, mental illness, in that category. And they made that very clear. It's like, they broke it out as like, okay, some people are just addicts, some people are just mentally disturbed, some people are addicted and mentally disturbed, and then we're gonna have like, then they had the other category, which basically were people who might not be suffering from either of those two things. And their approach overall was, you do not get to do drugs out in the open. if you are spotted doing such, the cops can arrest you. Now, it doesn't mean that you're going to jail, but they're basically offered a choice in the sense that you can either pick jail, because if you are going to continue on doing drugs out in the open and any sort of petty crimes and that stuff, we're not going to tolerate that. That's disallowed. You will have to either go to prison, but you can also sign up for a like a full recovery program, and then they will work with you and they will provide you shelter right away. So like you don't stay on the street, but you don't get you don't get your own apartment. You're going to be in some form of shelter, and then as you work on your plan, you can earn proper housing. So you can earn your own like individual unit, but you have to stick to your treatment plan, and that can be drug addiction treatment, and as well like if the person has mental illness, treatment for that as well. And there are penalties for like if the person stops taking their medication, or they start doing drugs again and not reporting, that can, if they had an apartment, they can lose that. So there is a pretty strong system of carrots and sticks, and they have done a pretty good job of, they shut all of their big encampments down in basically all over. They are having what I did find interesting is they are having a pretty big uptick in homelessness again. Like it's doubled over the last, over about 10 years. So, but like there seems to be multiple factors in that. Like it seems to be, a lot of it is also people who have come illegally and some other issues as well. But comparatively to the problems that they were having before, like they've done an excellent job in getting people off the streets, being treated. Switzerland did the same thing, right? Switzerland does have some supervised drug use where those people who are extremely addicted to something like heroin, they can come in into a unit, and they can, like, the government will provide the heroin, but they are extremely carefully monitored. Like they have to be on treatment plans. They can only do the drug they have to inject the drug while they're inside of the unit, and it's like they are highly monitored, and any sort of deviations from the plan will result in consequences. So there is, at least in Portugal, in Portugal, they seem to have much of the same approach as the Netherlands. I haven't done nearly as much research into them, but overall, the European model for these countries has been like a really good way of like kind of encapsulating it, is they hardened their social workers and then they softened their police, meaning that they kind of wanted their police to be able to, take a little bit more of a tactful approach with people suffering from mental illness and drug addiction, but still, enforce if needed by the point of the gun, if things get out of control. But they also wanted their social workers to be tougher and to be able to deal with somebody who might be, like it's not just in complete compassion the whole way through. It's a lot more tough love, and that's the basic idea, or the basic summary that I got from looking at some of their papers and their plans, and thus far they've seen good results.
I don't know if you mentioned the exact number in the Netherlands, but I was just comparing it to the downtown east side and the safe injection sites and whatnot. I think in North America, there's kind of a very big misconception that they just give out drugs in Europe as like, oh yeah, you can just get if you're an addict, you can just get your free drugs in Europe, and that's how they handle it. And there's kind of almost starting to be in like Vancouver was one of the first places that went with safe injection site, which is clean needles. And now there's ideas. I think Vancouver has started moving towards trying to get clean supply of heroin for people.
I do want to talk about safe injection sites because Canada's wild in terms of safe injection sites. You have to do a ton of licensing to get them, as you should. But I know in the city that I'm at the very least, and I'm sure this is happening all around Canada, the general push towards progressive treatment for the homeless is leading to people basically creating safe injection sites without any of the licensing that's supposed to be required. They'll just set up a place that homeless people and drug addicts are welcome, and it's like a no judgment zone. One of them that I've seen was a helping peer area. Like it was ex drug addicts helping drug addicts, and they provide clean needles and they provide rooms that they don't judge what you do in those rooms. And it's like you're running an illegal safe injection site, and this is just generally seen as a good thing in a lot of circles.
Yeah, and I was just going further with that. In California, they have they have injection sites where they actually just condone and let drug dealers operate. So they have open,
Crazy.
like they have
Supervised drug dealing is basically what it is, like government sanctioned.
Yeah, so they have the drug and the safe needle site, and they let the drug dealers come there with their drugs, sell the drugs on site. They watch them do it, and they just let them do it. So, and again, like I was saying, like in comparison with Europe, that's not actually what Europe does at all. I think it was the Netherlands they have less than 150 people receiving heroin from the government in the Netherlands.
Yeah, because those people were deemed to be so far gone in terms of their addiction that they couldn't, like they were just going to abandon whatever treatment with methadone that was given to them and just go right back to it. So
Well, they tried giving them, they tried everything else. They tried methadone, they tried all these things, and it's like the government only resorts to actually giving drugs to people in the cases where they've gone through multiple years of attempting to give them anything else.
Yeah, and it's not like these people are just like, here's a whole bunch of heroin, like go have fun. It is monitored, it is controlled. These people are still tracked in the sense that like the government is aware of them. They are, in terms of like, I don't know, like they're obviously not affixing collars to them or anything like that, but they know exactly who they are. They are monitoring them on an ongoing basis. It's not just, handing out drugs like candy and say, have at her, no judgment here. It's very well controlled.
An interesting thing I saw in Portugal with regards to this is because they really try to streamline drug addicts back into the workforce as well as they can, because that is quite an effective way to avoid relapse, is that they have vans that just roll around the city at set times, and like basically people go and pick up their methadone if they're an ex-drug addict, because they know when the van's coming by and the van knows that they're going to be at that workplace to pick up their methadone at that time. It's pretty interesting. I don't know if North America does that so much at all.
I have not seen that mentioned.
No, I don't
know either way.
Well, actually, there is a somewhat similar parallel in Rhode Island. Rhode Island has actually instituted medical assisted treatment, which is what they call it, MAT, and they have a bunch of essentially outpost setups where you can. So this is with like ex convicts that were addicts. They get them on one of the three main opiate blockers. And after they get out of prison, then they get like a card that has all their ID and stuff, and they just can go to any one of these like little outpost stores and show their card, and then they get their methadone, or like what the other two are, Suboxone and Vivitrol. And so it's like somewhat similar. I didn't hear, they didn't mention vans roaming around, but they have like all these little outposts, like pharmacies.
Yeah, so it's the same function.
Yeah, there's no like money. It doesn't cost anything. There's no like prescriptions or doctor visits needed. You just you have your card that they hand out, and you just bring your card in, and that's all you need. Mm-hmm. So it's like pretty streamlined in that way. But I think it was just like the other point I was going to mention. Khan was talking about like open drug markets and Europe not being in favor of them and shutting them down. Well, like in contrast, like when we're talking about like the supervised drug dealing, it's basically a supervised open air drug market. That's what they're having in California, and they are proposing in certain Canadian cities. And I've actually seen in Vancouver, I don't think it was city officials, but they were, it was some nonprofit that was selling drugs openly to addicts, like clean drugs or something. And obviously weren't arrested or anything. So it's just like not like the same approach. Like Europe's approach is definitely not what it doesn't have the same libertarian, like hands off approach where you just, let people choose their, recovery or choose their services or choose what they want to do. The European system is definitely skews towards like the paternalistic side to a degree. It's somewhere in the middle.
One of the things that in the outset of that plan that the Netherlands proposed, one of the main goals, they directly say it, is to reduce significantly the level of public nuisance caused by homeless people. So they are also recognizing at the government level that the homeless do pose like a problem to just like the community in which they live, and they want to ensure that that is being dealt with because it's it's a part of being fair to the rest of the people within your society, that to acknowledge and to deal with that issue. And that is something that I think with the progressive attitude is that's not even in the conversation, where it's just saying like these people are they're having a hard time, like get off their backs, like they're not that big of a deal to you, like stop it, you're being harsh and cruel and judgmental. And that is certainly something that I've seen in basically all of the literature that comes from the progressive side of things. It really is like these people are purely victims and they have no control, and like if we want to solve this, like you got to just be as open and welcoming and as like basically as progressive as possible with it. We were talking about this before the podcast, and it seems like Canada takes whatever the European ideal is, like whatever they're working on, and then just implements it in the most backwards way here, like just perverts it, and then thinks like, oh, we're doing the same thing as these hyper progressive places in Europe, and they're doing a great job, and so let's just copy that, and then they just turn it into a abomination.
I think there's some of that, but I also think it's more to do with like a particular brand of Ivy League liberal highly educated type ethos that is like, it has some sort of weird libertarian mix with like this very I don't think progressive is even the right word, although that's the word that most people would recognize. But it's like, you know what I mean? It has this like, California and like Silicon Valley and a lot of that like space is like, has this weird sort of libertarian like obsession. Like they're very obsessed with like personal freedom, but then they're,
except for when it comes to vaccines.
Yeah, but what's hilarious about that is that what the least vaccinated county was in it was the least vaccinated friggin' county in the US before COVID was in the heart of progressive California, and it was like a 50% vaccination rate, and they're having measles outbreaks because there was a bunch of like hyper progressives with this weird libertarian attitude in California. But again, I think that Canada gets like a lot of that blowback too, because a lot of our educational institutions are the same. And I think it's part of it is borrowing from Europe, but part of it is just a different type of attitude. Like, I don't think Europe has the same weird combination of values that are like in this value stew that comes up with these ideas, right? Like there seems to be a recognition in somewhere like the Netherlands that you need to have responsibility baked in there. Like it can't just be this like totally hands off, you know, ultimate individual freedom situation where you leave it entirely up to the person of what they want to do. That seems pretty unique to North America, and again, I think Canada gets it from the U.S. I think that particular strain of thinking is very American and comes to Canada that route. So I think that's maybe why Canada gets some of these, like, we have our social democracy from Europe, and then we import these American values, and it kind of mixes together and gets some weird outcomes.
Yeah, you can kind of tell, like, West Coast Canada is very much like West Coast states. Like, I think you said this, Hubbard's, like a while ago. Basically, like, the West Coast of Canada is 3 years behind the West Coast of the United States, just lagging behind in trends.
Well, and yeah, I mean, this is a great example. Like, I think Vancouver is currently like hitting the point where Seattle and San Francisco were 3 or 4 years ago in terms of like their problems, and I think the framing around it is, in terms of values, is like you can't give people total like freedom to do whatever they want, and then also like subsidize the consequences of their choices. Like, it just doesn't work, because then they never have, like, there's no feedback mechanism in their lives that will ever, change their behavior, right? If you just say, well, it's your choice what you want to do with your life, 100%, you can do whatever you want, including, stay addicted to heroin in perpetuity, and yet we'll also subsidize your choice to do that in perpetuity. Well, they're just gonna, like, people that are addicted are just gonna take heroin until they die, because they don't have the capacity in the throes of their addiction to get off themselves. They're not going to voluntarily get off, and we're giving them the tools to keep doing heroin. So it's just an inevitable consequence that you're going to have these like crazy high rates of overdose, and this population that never changes, because you're not doing anything to help them change, and you're just actually making it possible for them to keep doing the self-destructive behavior that's keeping them in the spot they're at. So you can't run a society with those like values, like with total freedom, but also unlimited willingness. Yeah, like
including from outcomes.
Yeah, like without letting people live with the consequences of their actions, and I mean, the consequences of their actions might actually be like, again, like going back to a lot of the interviews that I saw with homeless people, like one guy said that for him, compassion was getting arrested by a cop, because it was like he sat in a jail cell for 6 months, and he said jail sucked. He didn't like it, but it was like the first time since he got addicted to drugs that he actually had time to think about what he was doing with his life, and what it was doing to his family, and what it was, the implications, and he got clean. And I think like it's an easy middle ground to see, like, that you need to give people consequences, otherwise they're going to keep in, like, if someone's in the deepest throes of a self-destructive spiral, if you remove consequences, that's just going to lead them down that spiral faster. Like, they're not going to voluntarily step out. That's the whole point. Like, the whole reason they're at that point is because they haven't been able to, voluntarily throw. Like, do you think, and I think like it shows a lack of understanding of the psychology by like these people that think, oh, you can just offer them the services and at some point they'll take them.
That's exactly what I was just going to say. It really does seem like, from all of the progressive side that I was researching, the idea is, well, if you just give them, a house, they'll figure it out. It'll go away. Like, that's the whole idea around housing first. It's like, if you provide that house, that's the master key variable, and then they will get clean because they will somehow realize that their behavior is extremely destructive and problematic. And it just, to me, it really is, I think, like a deep misunderstanding at the fundamental level of what a real addiction is like and what basic human psychology is. Because, I can't imagine, like, and this is one of the really sad things is when they see a pretty big uptick in overdose deaths when they give people their like own apartment, because they'll just do heroin by themselves in that apartment while they'll do fentanyl, and then they die because they're just doing it without anybody being able to, like, check in on them. They got the door closed, maybe it's locked, especially if it's like an apartment that they're the only ones with a key to, and then so you have this huge uptick in deaths in these places. And, like, again, it's very strange to me that somebody could think that the solution to like a severe mental illness and addiction problem is just giving them their own space or the space to think or something like that, without any sort of other proper enforced like a treatments and any sort of structure around it. Like, a lot of the thing, like, not to short sell like what a lot of these progressives are doing, they do want like the treatment and that type of stuff, but because it's not like it's not enforced, it's not it's basically
well,
not enforced.
all their levels of services, they want to be voluntary, right? Like, they do want to provide addiction counseling, but it should be voluntary. They do want to provide like methadone or whatever, but the medication, taking your medication should be totally unsupervised and voluntary. Like, the whole project is supposed to be, we just build the services and they will come. They will, on their own volition, they will come down to our services. They will sign up for addiction counseling. They will show up to the counseling session. They'll put their effort into the counseling session. They'll show up and get their medication. They'll take it every day on time and properly, right? It's like, if the people in their addiction were able to voluntarily do those things, they would have already done them.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to be addicted.
Think about it this way. It's like, you can't even force yourself to go to the gym a couple of times a week. Like, how do you think somebody with a brutal addiction to heroin is going to be able to force themselves into some sort of a treatment program? Like, even for lack of a better term, like a completely normal, functional person struggles to get themselves to do all sorts of things that they know are good for themselves. And you tack on a mental illness and a severe addiction, good luck. It's just not going to happen.
And, like, though, if it was going to happen, it would have happened somewhere along the line before they got to that state that they're in, right? Like, if it was as simple as just having some sort of voluntary service available, those people would have taken advantage of that before they got into that situation. It's like, it's not going to work because it's already hasn't worked on the way down, right? Like, so it's not going to work on the way up. And I guess I think the broad strokes of it is you really get down to involuntary, having to force some sort of involuntary treatment program on people, and that's what the progressive camp doesn't want to have happen, right? And I think at the end of the day, that's like the only. What?
I don't know where that came from.
Are you still on?
Oh, yeah, I'm just
No, background
noise.
from the house to price.
Oh yeah, and I was just saying, like, I think the involuntary treatment is like the end goal for the other side of the argument, right? Like, it just, you have to put that as the you have to put that somewhere on the equation. Like, I don't know where that is, like what metrics you use to get someone. I think like just based on what I was seeing, the easy logic there is start to enforce the criminal code again and arrest people for committing crimes, and then give them the option of you can either go to prison for a certain amount of time based on the crime you committed, or you can go to inpatient treatment for 6 months. Then it is still in a degree voluntary. It's between prison, which they've earned based on their criminal actions, or it's inpatient treatment, and they get to make the choice.
Like, just to kind of point out, like, in terms of like the criminal thing, I just think, anybody else, if you go in, steal from a store or something like that, commit any one of these smaller crimes, like, again, like a functional person, they're going to get the book thrown at them in terms of like they're not going to just be catch and release like you're seeing here. And I think like, if you want in any way a stable functioning society, you have to enforce laws to the same degree for everybody, because otherwise, like, you just start to get into a problem where you're just gonna have more and more of the legal system start to erode, and that is like, that's insanely dangerous to any society that wants to stay stable for any length of time. Like, I do see that as like actually a pretty big threat to just like the general functioning of a normal society. Like, once that starts going, like, you can start to see the case for more and more, like, okay, well, we're not going to enforce a rule here, a rule there for these types, and these types, like, it's not their fault. I really do think like that is a slippery slope that you want to avoid at all costs.
And I think it's just a very easy sell to enforce your laws. And I think either outcome, regardless of what the person picks, I don't think a stint in prison is the worst thing for someone in the throes of addiction. Hopefully, at the very least, they get, clean for some period of time and can reflect, and they get 3 meals a day and they get some structure. And I think most of them would choose inpatient treatment anyway. So I think it's just like a win-win there. Like,
and it's interesting because I looked at the Vancouver subreddit, which is notoriously progressive, and there's a whole bunch of calls on it to reopen Riverview, which is the mental institution that they shut down for, basically like the problems that we had discussed earlier in the podcast. And, if you're getting, like, I think there is a real appetite for this to, like, not to like institutionalize people in like horrible facilities. The calls on Reddit were not like, yeah, throw them in some sort of hellhole and let them rot. It was, no, reopen such a facility that is up to proper standards of the modern era. You're not electroshocking people, and they need it. Like, they need to be here because they cannot function on any sort of regular level in general society, and they are disturbing everyone around them. And this is the hyper progressive subreddit, who are like, they're, I think the general public are starting to become more and more furious with what's going on. And I also think it's like, just at some point, just ignore the activists. Like, they don't know what they're talking about. And I think it's time to just cut them out of the conversation when they start throwing off like really stupid comments. Like, housing first. Everybody in Vancouver needs every homeless person in Vancouver needs an apartment on one of the nice apartment buildings downtown. Like again, like, I just think there's an appetite for proper change that could actually have some form of chance for improvement in the situation. And I think people are going to have to start stepping up and just ignoring the loud, crazy voices that come from the progressive, like the hyper progressive camps.
Well, I think the costs, like, people are starting to move in that direction. I think because of the obvious impact that the homeless situation is having in, say, Vancouver. You have tent cities everywhere and needles and all this stuff.
Fights, assaults. Like
And
I worked at a company in Vancouver, and one of my coworkers had to physically stop a homeless man from assaulting a young woman on the street. Like he started charging a young woman, and the guy had to like step in front and force him down. Like he was telling this as like a part of a safety meeting. I was like, holy shit, this is downtown Vancouver in the morning. It was like 10 a.m. that he had to do this when he was just taking his kid somewhere, and it was just madness. Like people don't want to deal with that, and they shouldn't have to.
yeah, so like you get those situations which are very visible, and I think like that's like what's driving like the demand for the conversation to happen now, and like a move away from the very hands-off like progressive policies that have been playing out for the last 5-10 years. But I think like what's underrated and not discussed nearly enough is like the more hidden costs and consequences for society. And like the big one for me is like the medical system. It's just crazy how much resources are utilized by like such a tiny minority of the population, with like emergency room visits and like acute care, first responders, all this stuff. Like they, the homeless population uses an absolute massively disproportionate amount of medical services, and those medical services are at the breaking point, post COVID with staffing shortages, and they've, in Canada especially, this is like the most pertinent to Canada because we have a, socialized healthcare system. It was already pretty bad, the healthcare system, and overutilized and overworked. And I think you just can't let a certain tiny minority of people, use more than their fair share of the medical system over something that can be prevented by another means, right? Like, if they are in inpatient treatment, they're not going to be using the emergency room every 3 days. And that just needs to be a conversation that happens, because it's funny that conversation was definitely not taboo, and definitely a front and center with like COVID, where it's like, oh, well, if, tons of people were saying, well, if you choose not to get vaccinated, then you should be at the back of the line for medical treatment, because it's a voluntary thing you choose to do that puts yourself in a bad situation. And, Canada has a socialized medical system, and therefore, if you're choosing to make bad decisions and land yourself in hospital with COVID, then you shouldn't get this, you should get deprioritized for healthcare. And it's just like, okay, well, that's, whether or not you agree with that argument, it's like the fact that was a mainstream talking point on both. Like I saw articles like that, opinion pieces like that published in mainstream Canadian news articles.
Ones that were pretty much like, no, you shouldn't even get it. Like I even heard that argument from like family members, like you shouldn't even get healthcare if you're non-vaccinated. Like you shouldn't pretty much be allowed.
Yeah, but I mean the finer point, or the greater point there, is just like Canadians recognize that like the healthcare system is a limited resource, and there's certain things, it's a zero-sum game, and if someone's taking an amount of resources from the system, that means someone else isn't getting care. And
to kind of put some numbers on this, like BC's ambulance delays are in some places like 3 hours. So it's like, yeah, if you were like a, you're just like a 32, 37, like who knows, like just a regular dude, regular lady, you get hit by a car and you gotta wait 3 hours for the paramedics to show up because they're dealing with, somebody's third overdose of the month, and you're bleeding out because, that ambulance is already on that way to that other call. Yeah, I think there's going to be there needs to be some questions and some serious conversations around that.
And that removes it out of the realm of just like your choice, your consequences, right? Like even if, even beyond like us as a society subsidizing the drug use, which is questionable, like we're subsidizing the health outcomes, and we're actually putting other people at risk and putting other people in harm's ways because of our choices on how to deal with this issue, right? Like, so again, like I said, like the hands off, like let people do what they want attitude and value system doesn't work in a society that's decided it's gonna, run socialized medicine. It's just, you can't have both and expect outcomes to make any sort of sense or be fair. So I think that's where that conversation should be brought along with the further conversation about just like the more obvious negative consequences that are visible. Like the invisible ones are probably worse in my estimation.
Well, the government will just switch over to euthanization, so problem solved.
Maybe do we want to go into that at all, or save that for another? I think that might be save that for another podcast.
Yeah, I mean the whole podcast in and of itself.
I think we could do a brief teaser. Yeah. Basically, the notion that Canada is currently euthanizing at an unprecedented rate in the world because the euthanization restrictions are much more liberal than anywhere else that allows euthanasia. So it was about 10,000 last year, which is incredible.
Which
and they're now
put that at like the biggest one since Nazis. So just put that in perspective.
But they're now pretty well considering that they'd start to theoretically include mental illness into things you can seek euthanasia for, which puts the homeless as severely mentally ill people that do not have their mental illness under control square in the sights of the euthanizing doctors, I guess, who prescribe euthanasia as a potential treatment method for health conditions as it is in Canada.
Yeah, just to like clarify there, like in most I think in every country essentially other than Canada that has euthanasia, doctors are not allowed to bring it up. It's the patient can bring it up, but the doctors aren't. In Canada, there's no restriction on that whatsoever. So there's frequently cases of doctors and nurses suggesting euthanasia as the next course of action in a situation.
And even for things that are not like, it's not like they're just suggesting it for, oh, you have stage 4 terminal cancer that you are 100% not going to live.
Well, we have no idea what they're suggesting it for. That's the point, is we don't know what they're suggesting it for because a lot of those conversations are going to be
there
privileged.
Whistleblower or like somebody who came to the press saying like a nurse suggested it for somebody's daughter who had MS and spinal bifida, saying like, hey, you should do this if you're not a selfish person. You should have your daughter euthanized. That was basically,
Yeah.
There's already like people coming out saying they are not suggesting this just for people who are, guaranteed basically to die of some sort of very painful and, drawn out process of the disease.
I just think it's just pretty crazy that we don't know what it's being suggested or not suggested for, because not only is it you're allowed to bring it up with the patient, there's no like rules around reporting or guidelines or
there's no reviews of the cases that have happened. Like in the Netherlands, that's what they do, is they do reviews on all the cases to see if anything crazy is going on.
Canada does do I think it's an annual review on the euthanasia program itself, but like, yes, there's much less review. There's much looser parameters on what conditions are eligible. There's also no requirement to exhaust treatments for your condition, which there is that requirement in Belgium and the Netherlands. So it's just a lot laxer overall in terms of just every aspect of it. And
you can see how this might actually be turned upon the homeless population. Like it's actually a legitimate concern, right? If they're coming in and they've had some sort of problem, the doctors might start suggesting like, hey, have you thought of this?
Well, yeah, like Price was saying, it's getting the only such proposals on the table right now are to make it even more lax, and including allowing, because right now you do have to live some sort of medical condition, and they are trying to bring mental illness as one of the as a medical condition acceptable for this. So you could you could have any sort of diagnosed mental illness listed on your euthanasia application, and that would be presumably adequate to be euthanized. And that's proposed for next year.
Yeah. And
Brave new world Canada's headed towards.
I guess maybe we should do a quick wrap on like what
what
people
it means
can.
your regular folk, and what you can do. So
Well-
you guys come to conclusions for that.
Yeah, mine's relatively straightforward, and that's just like get involved in municipal politics. Because a lot of this happens at the municipal level, actually. Because it's not like the laws aren't on the books for criminal behavior. It's just the municipalities tell their police not to enforce them. City councilors and mayors telling police not to do their job. I mean, that's like classic situation in Seattle, Portland, that kind of thing. Vancouver, even just very, very progressive mayors and city councilors, at their level, subverting the criminal justice system and telling police not to do their jobs. And that's the easiest way. Just vote people that are promising to enforce laws and bring accountability for committing crimes. And if some sort of treatment program or whatever in alternative to jail time, I think is a good idea. But at the very least, it needs to start with enforcing the laws again.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think if you're in a city, like, do your due diligence on like when you have a like a city election, because if you'll see like a lot of the people who have these harebrained ideas of how to deal with homelessness, they state it outrightly, and just don't vote for them. Maybe think about getting involved in the campaigns of those who are looking to actually change things for the better with like a much more reasonable approach that centers around like what Europe does, basically, where you're going to have carrots and sticks. Like, I think there are going to be some candidates who come up with those, especially since like the tide, I do see like the winds shifting a little bit, and hopefully we'll get more of those and make sure that like you're looking into who that is, and obviously vote with the way that you want. But if you from all of the research that I've done, it really does seem like you're going to have this approach more akin to Europe's, like Netherlands and whatnot, if you want to see any sort of alleviation of the homeless problem. And so obviously I think finding politicians and supporting them who actually have looked at this from a more objective standpoint is probably your best bet. And then, but also if you're already involved in, like in working with the homeless community or thinking about it, like, again, taking a bit more of I would say, slightly more paternalistic attitude towards it, not to, use too loaded of a term, but I think that that's really the only way that we're going to see any sort of proper alleviation in the next few years. Price, you got anything?
Well, just to add to the municipal thing is that there is a lot you can do often without voting if it comes down to an actual city. There are city council meetings and special meetings for certain things. So, for example, in my city, there was an attempt to open yet another unsanctioned safe injection site, except instead of being sort of out of the way and kind of like, people do generally not hate the idea as like having a safe place to inject. It's not the worst thing in the world if it's in a reasonable location. But there's an attempt to open one downtown, basically led to a huge city hall meeting and everyone getting together and deciding that it was unreasonable to have this effectively unsanctioned safe injection site in the middle of downtown without having gone through any of the permits that the government of Canada requires and the zoning that a city should require. And the city was like, oh yeah, this is actually a reasonable complaint and we can't really let this be there. So you can do stuff like that too.
Yeah, not just election cycles. And even writing letters, right? Like, I think a lot of politicians, like, if you write a well worded and, well thought out letter, that actually does have an impact, especially if, there's a few of you, you talk to some of your friends and family and they're seeing the same issues. And, if you discuss these things and they're on board, like, they get a bit of a, town council and city councils, they get a flood of those, they're gonna have to pay attention. And I think just spreading these ideas are also important. Like, the more this spreads, like, the more awareness and conversations open up about it, like, the better off we'll actually be to start implementing some proper, like, just some actual proper treatment and whatnot to help these people get off the streets, off drugs, and actually back into having what is like a good productive life. Like, that's, like, again, like, I don't want to say like all the progressives, they don't give a shit. Like, I listen to multiple like interviews and podcasts and whatnot with these people, and they clearly do care, at least the ones that I've listened to, but it just seems to be highly misguided. And so I think putting it more towards a more reasonable track is good, and more conversations around that and more knowledge of this, and framed in a way that it's like, it's not just a, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, like, boo-hoo, like that's not in any way what the Netherlands or Portugal or any of these other places have done. It's not like that at all. Like I've listened to these people like who are working on these programs over there, and they clearly care. They just understand that, yeah, it's going to take a little bit more than just providing a bunch of services and hoping people will take them up on the offer. And they've seen good success with it. So yeah, awareness and involvement is the way this is actually going to get solved, or alleviated at least. I don't think you're ever actually going to completely solve homelessness. I think it's
Well, I mean, there is one final solution.
That's true. Yeah, there is one way, and that is, we know how that went.
Tiny homes.
Yeah, exactly. Modular homes. That's always
The tiny home revolution. That's what everyone's sleeping on.
Well, our tiny homes will blanket the earth.
Exactly. Millions and millions and millions of tiny homes.
All right. We'll just wrap this up before it gets too Hitlerian. Anything else, you guys?
I think it's good.
All right.
I'm good.
Thanks for listening.